The most dangerous judgment is the one made before a single word is spoken. By 8:30 on Monday morning, Courtroom 6B of the Franklin County Courthouse was already overflowing. Attorneys shuffled thick case files across polished wooden tables. Reporters whispered near the back row, hoping today's hearing would produce a headline. Families of both parties sat shoulder to shoulder beneath the tall windows, where pale morning sunlight stretched across the marble floor like silent witnesses. Everything looked exactly as it should, except for one man. He entered without drawing attention. His suit was dark charcoal, pressed neatly but worn enough to suggest years of careful use rather than luxury. His silver hair framed a calm face untouched by hurry. In one hand, he carried a weathered leather briefcase. In the other, a folded black garment bag rested lightly against his leg. He walked neither proudly nor timidly, simply as someone who knew exactly where he belonged. Few people noticed him. Those who did quickly looked away. A young associate assumed he was another observer. A reporter guessed he might be a retired attorney. Someone near the front quietly muttered, probably in the wrong courtroom. The man offered no correction. Instead, he glanced around the room with quiet familiarity, almost as though every wooden bench and every framed portrait along the wall held memories only he could see. Near the entrance stood Bailiff Richard Collins. Tall, broad-shouldered, immaculate uniform. His polished badge reflected the courthouse lights every time someone entered. For 12 years, Richard believed one thing above everything else. Order depended on authority, and authority depended on immediate decisions. When his eyes landed on the older black man standing near the front benches, his expression tightened almost instantly. He stepped forward before the man had a chance to sit. "Sir." The word sounded less like a greeting than an instruction. "This section is reserved." The man looked up politely. "I understand." His voice was steady, calm, almost gentle. "I'll only be here for today's proceedings." Richard folded his arms. "Public seating is in the back." "Hey." Few nearby visitors lifted their heads. Nobody spoke. The older man glanced briefly toward the judge's bench. "I'll need to remain closer. You'll need to move." The sentence came sharper this time. "I appreciate your concern," the man replied with the same measured tone, "but I really should stay." Richard's patience disappeared. "Sir, you're holding up court." Several attorneys exchanged uncomfortable glances. One elderly woman quietly lowered her eyes. A law student reached for her notebook but stopped writing altogether. The room had become strangely still. The older man never raised his voice, never argued, never demanded respect. He simply looked at the bailiff for a long second, as though weighing whether another explanation would change anything. Apparently deciding it would not, he nodded once. "As you wish." He bent down, lifted his briefcase, and picked up the black garment bag resting beside his chair. Richard motioned firmly toward the hallway. "This way." Without another word, the man walked toward the courtroom doors. No anger, no complaint, no dramatic protest. Only quiet footsteps echoing against marble. As the heavy wooden doors closed behind him, conversations slowly returned. Someone shrugged. Another spectator whispered, "Good call." A young attorney nodded approvingly. Security's tighter these days. Richard allowed himself a small breath of satisfaction. One less distraction. Exactly how a courtroom should function. He straightened his uniform and checked his watch. The judge was running several minutes late. Unusual. Still, there was no reason for concern. The courtroom settled once more into its routine rhythm. Folders opened. Pens clicked. The clerk organized the docket. Outside, distant footsteps echoed through the corridor. No one paid them any attention. No one wondered where the older man had gone. No one questioned whether assumptions had quietly replaced facts. And no one, not the attorneys, not the reporters, not the spectators, and certainly not Bailiff Richard Collins, could have imagined that the very man they had just watched disappear through those courtroom doors would return within minutes, as the only person in the building with the authority to begin the day's proceedings. The courtroom resumed its familiar rhythm as though nothing unusual had happened. Legal pads opened. Laptops cleans gelao. The soft hum of whispered conversations slowly replaced the silence left behind by the older man's departure. To nearly everyone inside Courtroom 6B, the interruption had already become yesterday's news. Richard Collins stood beside the entrance with his hands clasped neatly behind his back. His posture reflected years of discipline, and his expression carried the quiet confidence of someone who believed he had prevented a disruption before it could begin. A young prosecutor walked past him. "Good catch," she said with an approving smile. Richard nodded once. "Just doing my job." Those 4 words settled comfortably in his mind. For 12 years, they had explained nearly every difficult decision he had made. Across the room, 2 attorneys exchanged quiet remarks. "I've never seen him before. Probably wandered into the wrong courtroom." At least the bailiff handled it quickly. Neither man considered another possibility. Assumptions often travel faster than facts. Near the gallery, an elderly woman frowned toward the closed courtroom doors. She had noticed something different about the older black gentleman. Not fear, not confusion, but familiarity. He had looked at the courtroom as though he knew it well. Before she could mention it to anyone, the clerk's voice interrupted her thoughts. "All rise in approximately 2 minutes." People immediately gathered their papers. Conversations faded. Chairs scraped softly against the polished floor. Richard glanced once more at the hallway outside. Empty. Satisfied, he checked the courtroom schedule clipped to his folder. The presiding judge had been delayed only once in the previous 6 months. Today marked the 2nd time. Strange, but not alarming. Inside the courtroom, impatience quietly began replacing curiosity. A defense attorney looked at his watch. Another sighed. One reporter adjusted her camera, wondering whether the delay might produce a more interesting story than the hearing itself. No one connected the delay to the man who had just been escorted outside. Richard certainly didn't. He replayed the encounter in his mind, searching for any detail he might have overlooked. Dark suit, old briefcase, Golmsbake, polite voice. Nothing unusual. If anything, the man's calm acceptance had made Richard even more certain he'd made the correct decision. People with legitimate business usually explain themselves. That man hadn't. Outside the heavy courtroom doors, footsteps echoed faintly through the marble hallway. Steady, measured, neither hurried nor hesitant. Richard barely noticed. Another courthouse employee crossed the corridor carrying files. A pair of deputies walked toward the elevators. The building continued breathing with its ordinary Monday routine. Inside, the clerk straightened the microphone position before the empty judge's bench. The polished wooden chair behind it remained vacant. Every passing second made the silence feel slightly heavier. The attorneys stopped talking altogether. Even the reporters lowered their voices. Richard checked the hallway once again. Still no judge. A crease slowly formed across his forehead. For the first time that morning, certainty gave way to a question he couldn't quite answer. Then, somewhere beyond the courtroom doors, another sound emerged. Not hurried footsteps, not raised voices, just the deliberate click of polished shoes approaching with calm, unwavering confidence. One by one, heads turned toward the entrance. Without realizing why, the room instinctively fell completely silent. Whatever was about to happen next would erase every assumption made only moments before. The courtroom doors opened without ceremony. No announcement, no raised voice, only the quiet sound of polished leather shoes crossing marble. Every head turned. Richard Collins looked first, then froze. The older black man had returned. The same silver hair, the same weathered briefcase, the same calm expression, but everything else had changed. The dark armor bag was gone. In its place flowed a perfectly tailored black judicial robe, its folds moving gently with each measured step. A gold judicial seal rested near the collar, catching the morning light for only an instant before disappearing into the deep fabric. He didn't walk like someone demanding attention. He walked like someone who had never needed it. The conversations stopped mid-sentence. An attorney lowered the file he had been reading. The court reporter's fingers hovered above the keyboard. Even the ceiling seemed to hold its breath. Richard stared in disbelief. His eyes shifted from the robe to the man's face, then back again. No, The word escaped his lips before he realized he had spoken aloud. The older gentleman approached the bench with the same quiet confidence he had shown only minutes earlier. He placed the worn leather briefcase on the clerk's desk. "Good morning, Ms. Harper." The court clerk blinked once before standing immediately. "Good morning, Your Honor." The title echoed through the silent courtroom like the strike of a gavel. "Your Honor." Several attorneys instinctively rose to their feet. Others followed almost automatically, one after another, until the entire courtroom was standing. Everyone, except Richard. He remained rooted beside the entrance, unable to move. His face had drained of color. The realization arrived all at once. The man he had escorted from the courtroom, the man he had assumed didn't belong, the man he had ordered to leave, was Judge Marcus Ellison, the presiding judge assigned to today's hearing. Richard's heartbeat pounded louder than the room itself. Fragments of the conversation replayed mercilessly inside his mind. "This section is reserved. You'll need to move. You're holding up court." Each sentence now sounded heavier than the last. Judge Ellison turned toward the courtroom, acknowledging no one's expressions. Not the stunned attorneys, not the embarrassed spectators, not even Richard. His composure never wavered. He simply adjusted the sleeves of his robe before taking his seat behind the bench. Only then did he lift his eyes. They swept calmly across the room, resting for barely a second on Richard. There was no anger in them, no triumph, no desire for revenge, only a quiet sadness that somehow weighed far more than outrage ever could. Richard wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but no words came. Judge Ellison opened the leather folder before him with practiced precision. His voice, when it finally filled the courtroom, carried neither accusation nor resentment. "Good morning." A pause. "I apologize for the brief delay." Another pause. "Shall we begin?" No lecture, no humiliation, no public rebuke. Just 3 simple sentences delivered with unwavering dignity. And in that moment, every person inside courtroom 6B understood something Richard Collins would remember for the rest of his life. Authority could command obedience, but true respect never needed to announce itself. No one remembered the first case called that morning. Years later, attorneys would remember the silence instead. Judge Marcus Ellison reviewed the case file before him with deliberate care, turning each page as though nothing extraordinary had happened only moments earlier. His voice remained steady. "Counsel, you may proceed." The prosecutor rose. The defense attorney followed. Witnesses were sworn in. Evidence was introduced. The courtroom slowly returned to its intended purpose: justice. But one man heard almost none of it. Richard Collins stood motionless beside the courtroom doors, his shoulders still square by habit, though certainty had long since abandoned him. Every sentence Judge Ellison spoke echoed against the memory of his own. "You'll need to move. This section is reserved. You're holding up court." The words no longer sounded professional. They sounded painfully small. Richard searched for something, anything, that might explain what had happened. Had the judge arrived without identification? Yes. Had he introduced himself? No. Did that excuse what Richard had assumed? The answer came before the question had fully formed. No, because he had never asked. During a brief recess, the attorneys gathered quietly near the counsel tables. "You know who that is?" one whispered. "Judge Marcus Ellison. I've appeared before him twice. They say he's one of the fairest judges in the state." Another attorney nodded. "He never raises his voice. He doesn't have to." Richard overheard every word. Each compliment felt heavier than criticism. Fair, patient, respected. The very qualities he had failed to recognize in the man standing only a few feet away earlier that morning. Judge Ellison remained behind the bench reviewing documents while the courtroom emptied for the 10-minute recess. He worked in complete silence. No dramatic gestures. No conversations about what had happened. No attempt to embarrass anyone. Richard watched from across the room. The opportunity to apologize stood directly in front of him. Yet his feet refused to move. For the first time in his career, authority offered him no answers. Finally, the court clerk approached Judge Ellison with another stack of files. I'm so sorry about earlier, Your Honor. Judge Ellison looked up briefly. There is no need to apologize for something you did not do. His tone held neither bitterness nor sarcasm, only quiet honesty. The clerk hesitated. I can't believe it happened. Judge Ellison closed the file in front of him. It happened. A pause settled between them. The important question is whether anything is learned from it. Nothing more. No speech. No accusation. Just one simple observation. Richard felt those words more deeply than any public reprimand. Across the courtroom, sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. The same room, the same people, yet everything felt different. Not because the judge had revealed power, but because he had chosen restraint when humiliation would have been easy. Richard lowered his eyes for the first time that morning. He realized respect was never something a badge could demand. It was something character quietly earned. And standing only a few yards from the bench, he understood that the hardest judgment he would face that day would not come from Judge Marcus Ellison. It would come from the man staring back at him every morning in the mirror. When the recess ended, Judge Marcus Ellison returned to the bench, carrying nothing more than a legal pad and a fountain pen. There was something almost disarming about him. No dramatic entrance. No commanding gestures. No reminder that everyone in the courtroom now knew who he was. He simply took his seat. Please be seated. The words were calm, measured, ordinary. Yet somehow they carried more authority than the loudest command Richard Collins had ever given. The afternoon session began with testimony from a key witness. The witness stumbled through several answers, contradicting earlier statements. Two attorneys objected within seconds. The courtroom grew tense. Judge Ellison listened without interruption. He never rushed to speak. Instead, he folded his hands lightly on the bench and allowed both attorneys to finish completely. Only then did he lean forward. "Counsel," he said quietly, "the court is not interested in who speaks first." A brief pause followed. "It is interested in who speaks accurately." The room fell silent. One sentence. No raised voice. No embellishment. Just clarity. Both attorneys nodded immediately. Even the witness seemed to relax. Richard watched the exchange with growing disbelief. That was leadership, not force, not intimidation, just confidence built on fairness. Throughout the afternoon, Judge Ellison treated every person exactly the same. The prosecutor, the defense attorney, the court clerk, the witness, even the young intern who accidentally dropped a stack of files near the jury box. Instead of showing irritation, Judge Ellison simply waited until the papers had been gathered. "There is no hurry," he said with a reassuring smile. "We're here to reach the right conclusion, not the fastest one." The nervous intern whispered, "Thank you, Your Honor." Richard noticed something remarkable. Every person who entered the courtroom seemed calmer after speaking with Judge Ellison. His authority never created fear. It created trust. That realization settled heavily inside Richard. For years, he had believed respect came from maintaining absolute control. Judge Ellison demonstrated something entirely different. People respected him because they felt seen, not judged, not dismissed. Seen. Late in the afternoon, another visitor quietly entered through the courtroom doors. An elderly janitor pushing a maintenance cart stopped briefly near the entrance, unsure whether he should continue cleaning. Richard instinctively stepped forward. For a split second, the habits of that morning returned. Then he stopped himself. Instead of assuming, he asked politely, "Sir, may I help you?" The janitor smiled. "I was told to wait until court adjourns." "Of course." Richard nodded warmly. "Thank you." The exchange lasted less than 15 seconds. Judge Ellison happened to notice. Their eyes met briefly across the courtroom. This time, there was something different in the judge's expression. Not approval, not forgiveness, simply quiet acknowledgement, as though he had witnessed a very small decision that might one day become a much larger change. Richard lowered his gaze. For the first time that day, he understood that growth rarely arrived through grand speeches or public humiliation. Sometimes it began with a single question asked before making a single assumption. And without saying a word about the events of that morning, Judge Marcus Ellison had already delivered the most powerful lesson anyone inside Courtroom 6B would receive that day. The final case of the afternoon ended just before 5 o'clock. Judge Marcus Ellison closed the file before him with the same deliberate care he had shown all day. The court is adjourned. The wooden gavel touched the sound block only once. Its echo lingered through the courtroom long after everyone had begun gathering their belongings. Attorneys packed briefcases. Reporters hurried toward the hallway. The spectators slowly disappeared through the heavy wooden doors. Within minutes, Courtroom 6B was almost empty. Richard Collins remained exactly where he had stood for most of the day. He watched as the court clerk organized tomorrow's docket before quietly leaving the room. The bailiff knew this was his chance. If he walked away now, the apology would never happen. If he stayed, there would be no audience. Only truth. Judge Ellison removed his reading glasses and carefully placed them inside the worn leather briefcase Richard now recognized from that morning. Nothing about it suggested prestige. Years of use had softened the leather. The corners showed gentle wear. It belonged to a man who valued purpose more than appearance. Richard finally stepped forward. His footsteps sounded unusually loud in the nearly empty courtroom. Judge Ellison looked up, neither surprised nor impatient. He simply waited. Richard stopped several feet from the bench. For the first time in many years, words failed him. He had rehearsed explanations throughout the day. None of them sounded honest anymore. I am sorry. The sentence came quietly. I was wrong. Silence filled the room. Richard lowered his eyes. I judged you before I knew anything about you. His voice grew heavier. I told myself I was protecting the courtroom. A painful pause followed. But I wasn't protecting justice. I was protecting my assumptions. Judge Ellison remained silent for several seconds. Not because he lacked an answer, because he respected the weight of the moment. Finally, he spoke. Mr. Collins. Richard looked up. Do you know why I never told you who I was? Richard slowly shook his head. I wanted to. Judge Ellison offered a faint, thoughtful smile. I know. Another quiet pause settled between them. But titles reveal authority. He gently rested one hand on the bench. Character reveals people. Richard listened without moving. Judge Ellison continued. If respect only exists after someone learns your position, then it was never respect. It was recognition. The words landed with extraordinary force. No accusación, no humiliación, only truth. Richard felt every layer of pride he had carried for years quietly fall away. I don't expect you to forget today, Judge Ellison said. In fact, I hope you never do. Richard swallowed hard. I won't. Judge Ellison nodded. Good. Then something valuable came from it. He closed the briefcase and stepped away from the bench. As he reached the courtroom doors, he stopped for only a moment. Without turning around, he spoke one final sentence. Every person who walks into this courtroom deserves the same question before they deserve the same judgment. Then he disappeared into the hallway. Richard remained alone beneath the fading afternoon light filtering through the courthouse windows. The room felt larger than it had that morning. Quieter, almost sacred. He looked once toward the empty judge's bench, then toward the courtroom doors where strangers entered every single day. Tomorrow, hundreds of people would pass through those doors. Most would never remember the bailiff's name, but Richard silently promised himself that every one of them would be greeted not by an assumption, but by a question. The next morning, the courthouse looked exactly as it always had. The marble floors reflected the early sunlight. Security officers greeted familiar faces. Lawyers hurried toward courtrooms with coffee cups balanced over stacks of files. To everyone else, it was simply another Tuesday. For Richard Collins, it felt like the first day of a different career. He arrived 30 minutes early, not because the schedule demanded it, because he wanted time to think. Standing alone inside Courtroom 6B, he looked at the empty benches that had witnessed yesterday's lesson. Nothing inside the room had changed. The judge's bench remained where it had always been. The witness stand stood beneath the state seal. The American flag rested quietly in the corner. Yet Richard saw the room differently now. He no longer saw a place where order was enforced. He saw a place where dignity had to be protected. One by one, visitors began arriving. An elderly woman entered carrying a worn canvas bag. Instead of pointing her toward the gallery, Richard smiled. "Good morning, ma'am. May I help you find your seat?" The woman looked pleasantly surprised. "Thank you." Moments later, a young man wearing work boots hesitated near the entrance. His clothes were dusty. His hands showed the rough marks of construction work. Richard noticed several people glance toward him before quickly looking away. Yesterday, Richard might have done the same. Today, he walked over first. "Good morning. Are you here for today's hearing?" The young man nodded nervously. "My brother's case." Richard checked the docket. "You're in the right courtroom. I'll show you where to sit." Relief spread across the visitor's face. "Thank you, sir." It was such a small exchange. Less than 30 seconds. Yet it felt strangely significant. Richard realized respect often revealed itself through ordinary moments rather than extraordinary ones. As the courtroom gradually filled, Judge Marcus Ellison entered through the private door behind the bench. Their eyes met briefly. Richard offered a quiet nod. Judge Ellison returned it. Nothing more needed to be said. The apology had already been accepted through action rather than words. Throughout the morning, Richard noticed something he had ignored for years. Every person who entered the courtroom carried an invisible story. The anxious mother twisting her wedding ring. The teenager afraid to testify. The exhausted public defender who had clearly worked through the night. The elderly veteran walking carefully with a cane. Before yesterday, they had been part of the crowd. Today, they were individuals. Human beings before they were titles, appearances, or assumptions. During a short break, the court clerk smiled as she watched Richard patiently answer questions from several confused visitors. "You seem different." Richard considered the observation. "I hope so." She laughed softly. "What happened?" Richard glanced toward the judge's bench, then back toward the open courtroom doors. "I finally learned the difference between controlling a room," he paused, "and serving the people inside it." Outside, another group of strangers approached the entrance, each carrying worries no one else could see. Richard stepped forward to greet them, not because his badge required it, because his character finally did. And without realizing it, the lesson Judge Marcus Ellison had quietly lived the day before had already begun changing far more than one man's judgment. It had begun changing the very way justice was welcomed through the courtroom doors. Weeks passed, and the story of what happened inside Courtroom 6B traveled farther than anyone expected. At first, it moved through courthouse whispers. A clerk told a public defender. The public defender mentioned it to a colleague. A reporter who had witnessed the moment wrote about it without naming Richard Collins, focusing instead on the danger of deciding who belongs before asking why they came. By the end of the month, the article had been shared across the state. Most readers praised Judge Marcus Ellison. Some demanded punishment for the bailiff. Others argued that one apology could never erase years of hidden bias. Judge Ellison read every reaction. He understood the anger. He also understood something anger often forgot. Accountability was not only about removing someone from power. Sometimes it was about forcing that person to use power differently. Richard was placed under formal review. He accepted the investigation without complaint. He completed additional training, met with community leaders, and listened to stories from people who had entered courthouses already feeling guilty in the eyes of strangers. For once, he did not defend himself. He listened. A black mother described how officers had searched her teenage son while ignoring others beside him. An elderly man explained how courthouse staff repeatedly assumed he was a defendant instead of an attorney. A young woman spoke about the exhaustion of constantly proving she belonged in rooms she had earned the right to enter. Their words exposed something Richard had never wanted to see. His behavior had not begun that morning. That morning had merely revealed it. The truth was painful, but pain, when faced honestly, can become a doorway. Months later, Richard helped create a new visitor policy for the courthouse. Every guest would be greeted before being directed. Every question would come before every assumption. Every staff member would receive training centered not only on security, but on dignity. The policy seemed simple. yet its meaning reached far beyond procedure. One afternoon, Judge Ellison stood near the entrance and watched Richard assist an older black attorney carrying a weathered briefcase. Richard did not examine his clothing. He did not question his place. He simply opened the door. "Good afternoon, sir. How may I help you?" The attorney smiled. "I know exactly where I'm going." Richard stepped aside respectfully. "Then welcome." Judge Ellison observed the exchange in silence. There was no applause, no public announcement, no perfect ending. Richard could not undo the humiliation he had caused, but he could decide what that humiliation would create. Shame could become resentment, or it could become responsibility. That was the difference between being exposed and being transformed. As the courthouse doors closed behind the visitor, Judge Ellison returned to his chambers. He had never believed justice was only what happened from the bench. Justice also lived in hallways, in greetings, in pauses before judgment. And sometimes, its greatest victory was not destroying the person who had failed. It was making sure that failure never reached another innocent stranger again. Nearly a year later, visitors entering the Franklin County Courthouse knew nothing about the morning that had quietly changed one courtroom forever. They walked through the security checkpoint carrying briefcases, backpacks, diaper bags, and folders filled with documents that represented some of the hardest days of their lives. Some came seeking justice. Others came hoping for mercy. Many arrived carrying fear they never spoke aloud. To them, Courtroom 6B looked like any other courtroom. The polished wooden benches, the state seal behind the bench, the flags standing silently in their corners. Nothing suggested that one ordinary morning had become an extraordinary lesson. Richard Collins was still standing at the entrance. His badge had not changed. His uniform looked exactly the same, but the man wearing them had. Every visitor received the same greeting. "Good morning. How may I help you today?" The words had become more than courtesy. They had become a promise. One rainy afternoon, an elderly black gentleman stepped hesitantly through the courtroom doors carrying a worn leather briefcase. For a brief instant, the image transported Richard back to that unforgettable morning. The memory arrived as clearly as if no time had passed. The assumptions, the embarrassment, the silence. This time, Richard smiled warmly. "Welcome, sir. Is there anything you need before court begins?" The gentleman returned the smile. "No, I know exactly where I'm supposed to be." Richard nodded respectfully and stepped aside. As the visitor walked toward the front of the courtroom, Richard felt something he had not expected. Gratitude. Not because he had corrected a mistake, but because he had been given the chance to become someone different from the man he used to be. Across the room, Judge Marcus Ellison observed the exchange while organizing the morning's docket. He said nothing. He simply allowed a quiet smile to touch the corner of his face before opening the first case file. Some victories never appear in official records. No transcript captured that moment. No newspaper reported it. No audience applauded. Yet it represented the truest kind of justice. Justice that changed a person before it changed a system. As court adjourned later that afternoon, Richard paused alone inside the empty courtroom. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, painting long golden lines across the wooden floor. He looked toward the judge's bench, where everything had begun, then toward the entrance where countless strangers would continue arriving tomorrow. He finally understood what Judge Ellison had taught without ever intending to humiliate him. A courtroom exists to judge actions, never appearances. A badge grants authority. A robe represents responsibility. But neither means anything without character, because character is revealed long before titles are introduced. As Richard turned off the courtroom lights, the room disappeared into quiet shadows. Only one lesson remained. The most dangerous judgment is not the one spoken from the bench. It is the one formed before a single question is asked. And perhaps the greatest act of justice is not proving that someone was wrong. It is choosing, from that day forward, to see every stranger first as a human being, because every person deserves the dignity of being known before they are ever judged.